I'm going to talk about compound registration. It's the name of our product. I think registration in several aspects is probably well known to you, but nevertheless, I'd like to give you a very brief introduction what compound registration is all about. Primarily, it's there in order to give you the opportunity to maintain a catalog of unique substances that you may have produced, synthesized, or somehow ingested from external libraries in-house in your organization. This is sounding like a trivial task because all you have to do is worry about uniqueness. But then again, different organizations that we serve, we see a lot of variability in terms of structure quality considerations, how should a structure be represented, as well as when it comes to the peculiarities of stereochemistry, how should individual stereochemistries that aren't well defined be handled by the system itself. And this is one of the kind of core values of our compound registration product, that it takes very good care of these. The third point is about the registration process, the way as our customers use this at the very moment. Half of them try to stay away from the actual registration user interface that we're providing and say everything that comes alongside with documentation of our processes in-house comes through the ELN, and ideally we'd like to be able to push everything that is created within the electronic lab notebook directly into compound registration. In that sense, users rarely seeing the user front end that we also provide. On the other hand, for people, the organizations that tend to be a little smaller, don't have that sophisticated process in place, they're very happy to use our user interface in order to upload just a bunch of compounds, for example. And because of the previous statements, when you have larger organizations that typically have a kind of well-integrated informatics landscape, since the compound collection is the very core of intellectual property within that organization, we need to provide endpoints that allow for integrating these various bits and pieces of software with each other, and that's something we put a lot of effort into. What I'm going to kind of describe here is essentially a bare-bone process of how registration can work. Generally, you have submissions. These might be chemical structures that you see on the left-hand side. In case there is no particular issue with these compounds, it can be a straight through process for automatic registration, then everything's fine. There might be cases when you have problems with the structure. Say these are problems with the structure depiction because the bond lengths are off. For some of those cases, we might be able to apply some automatic fixers. So also there, no concern for the particular user in order to kind of deal with these issues. On the other hand, what can also happen at any time is that there might be problems with the additional data that comes along, or there might be problems with the structure that you cannot correct automatically. In these cases, everything falls back into a kind of review area that we call staging area. And then an expert user typically comes in and takes care of these problems in order to have that compound registered ultimately. What I'm going to show you next is how, for example, the web UI of form-based registration looks like. You draw the structure on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, you see a couple of data fields that you can use to describe. All of these are fully customizable. And then below here, that's something a lot of our users love, is kind of a live opportunity to check existing problems with a structure on one hand, and the other piece is a stereo analyzer that essentially gives you a summary of all the stereo centers that are currently defined in your molecule and what the current depiction actually means in the context of the molecule representation. This is especially valuable because, well, in the cheminformatics space, we use terms that might not be obvious to a regular chemist, so we try to kind of bridge that gap and also help the chemist to actually draw the molecule as they should draw it according to good quality definitions. I'd like to also mention now a few kind of improvements that we have implemented over the past year. I prepared 2 slides for this just in order to cover the kind of main themes of work that we have been implementing. The first part is all around bulk upload improvements. use case here typically is that a chemist comes and says, I've synthesized somewhere between 20 and 100 compounds in the last few weeks. I'd like to get those uploaded. We've done a lot of work in order to kind of help the user understand if there's problems with their upload. And you see here on the right-hand side, that's a kind of new summary for each of those bulk uploads, where you can see how many compounds have been uploaded, how many of those have already been registered straight away, how many of those might be in a state waiting for approval, but there is no quality issues with them. Then there might be a couple of failed ones that typically fail because of existing validation errors. And then below you have a summary of the error categories, which you can kind of take care of one by one. In case you kind of ingest very large libraries, there's even an option to say that has been prepared, say, through Pipeline Pilot or a KNIME workflow. I'd like to download all of my failed submissions, repair them in an external tool, and then update my submissions accordingly. That's also possible. And last but not least, you'll be able to download a PDF report that kind of summarizes the current registration status for all the compounds of that given file upload. The other part that we have taken care of is around the use case when people don't really know which structures they're dealing with. Nevertheless, they need a corporate identifier in order to proceed operations. For this, we've had a kind of workaround in the past saying that we represent these kind of no structures as star atoms, but kind of treat them otherwise pretty much as regular chemical structures. Because we're seeing this case happening more and more, we've decided to actually bring this into a bespoke no structure type, for which we also don't run structure quality checks simply because it doesn't make sense. And we also have mechanisms built in that you can kind of, if you know the identifiers of no structures through a bulk upload, you'll be able to upload new lots of already existing no structures because it's essentially the same sample. What I'd kind of like to talk about next is, so how can you imagine this being deployed in an informatics landscape within an organization? This might look a little messy, but I'll walk you through this in a bit. Everything that you see in this kind of cyan teal color is actually coming with the compound registration product. So at the core of it, we have the web application itself, the compound registration, that is accessible through a set of RESTful web services. It communicates with its own bespoke database schema that kind of houses all of the compound collection. And then, of course, what you've seen is that we have a kind of well-built web interface that users interact with in order to register things, search for things. Next to the actual compound registration application, we also have embedded a kind of message queue that is important because with that message queue you can essentially propagate registrations or update to already registered records to downstream applications that are essentially consumer systems, which typically are bringing together, aggregating compound information together with biological measurements and other types of data that exists out there for reporting and analysis purposes. Often we then have custom downstream clients that essentially take the information out of the message queue, transform this into a shape of, or bring the information into a shape that is suitable for digestion by the downstream systems. And then one of the possible endpoints is to actually just shove this into a data warehouse, or it might actually be going into an application directly that maintains its own individual data store. On the upstream side, we have a couple of customers that are also connecting this to further upstream library catalogs, where they're monitoring, for example, availability of substances and then register available fragments right into our compound registration. For those ones, they typically receive regular updates to these upstream databases and then use a database poller service in order to get the new relevant records and feed them directly into our compound registration system. Then what I've also already mentioned is we have integrations with a number of electronic lab notebook providers, among others IDBS ArcSpan, or also PerkinElmer. Their users draw reactions, for example, in order to define a synthesis scheme, and the individual reactants as well as the products get picked up within the ELN space and then get forwarded directly into the registration system as well. So there a user then doesn't need to interact with the registration system because it's all automated behind the scenes. Similar things you might imagine around sample management or inventory management systems. We have an integration with, for example, Titian Mosaic, where we even have a setup where after successful registration, you just click a button inside the compound registration UI and say, please let me now add a couple of samples to my Mosaic system of the given compound. And then, of course, there is the kind of programmatic access. We have pipeline pilot components that directly talk to the registration system, but also through KNIME, if you're using the kind of generic REST nodes, you can make registration calls that come out of a pipeline workflow, so to speak. You can see that this kind of ecosystem can grow very complex. Because of that, we need to take care of a number of different extension points, and I'm just listing a couple of things that we have built in addition to the core product for some of our customers here. That starts from very simple things. I'd like to have a very custom ID format that we don't support out of the box, so then we can provide you with some generators. We can also look at validations where we're saying that these are not coming out of the box, but we'd like to provide some additional data validations that are based on structure features, for example. We'd like to generate some additional data to the compounds. And we can kind of serve this through extension points. And I've already mentioned the integration with Mosaic. You have a kind of button there that you can define that says, okay, just add these also to my inventory. And of course, we've talked about downstream clients in case you need to shape the data that's coming out of your registration system for your downstream applications. How is this product served to customers? First of all, primarily it was an on-premise application. Lately, however, we're seeing a lot of people also expressing their interest in serving this through an AWS environment. So it runs on an EC2 instance, it connects to an RDS data schema, either MySQL or Oracle flavor. And we've introduced this at BioIT last year. We also have an Amazon Marketplace image that theoretically you could just select, grab, and it runs. That is something that we had prepared in the context of, you might have heard of the Amazon Biotech Blueprint initiative, where essentially they're saying we take a couple of best-of-breed vendor applications, compound registration is one among them, and prepare the integration among these tools as a predefined template, so that, for example, small companies, startups would have a ready-to-operate environment at their fingertips at disposal in order to, well, take up operations. Maybe some words about where we're going with this. A lot of this is currently related to a kind of larger project, and I don't want to go through these things bullet point by bullet point. Generally speaking, there is a lot of enhancements that we'll talk about better controlling the flow of submissions that may have failed, or where users might not be exactly sure about how to proceed with those. So internal assignments between different people that belong to different roles in an organization plays a role here. And the other part is around tracing history of what has happened to a compound. We're doing improvements in order to make sure that every single thing, even standardization steps or fixing steps, are recorded in the compound registration. So in case you have a different structure finally registered than what you had submitted initially, that you don't feel confused because you might not understand what has been going on. So that will be more traceable in the future. Second half of the year is largely around bulk modifications. While we have the ability to change records one by one, we have a lot of work to do in order to ensure that people can also say bulk modify additional data, merge compound trees with each other or split trees because of new analytical results may have come in, and these kind of stereoisomers that weren't quite clearly defined previously can now be sorted out and restructured in a consistent fashion. And last but not least, that's something I gave you a teaser in my presentation yesterday on the biomolecule toolkit. We're also looking at ways how to bring the world of biologics or biological molecule registration closer to the world of small molecule registration. One of the reasons for that is that we're seeing that a number of customers are currently struggling with the fact that they have very bespoke registration system for, say, nucleic acids or peptides. They have a parallel system for small molecules. And sometimes even the users get confused. Where should I actually register my structure? You have seen that we have a quite seamless transition option at this moment in order to go between a small molecule representation and a more sequence or monomer-based representation. And we can use this in order to hopefully provide a smarter system where we provide you with a single endpoint for registration, and then above the individual kind of bespoke registration pieces that we have established so far, you have something that, well, I call a perception engine, essentially something that looks into your submission, tries to identify, are you sending me a peptide, are you sending me a sequence, are you sending me a pure chemical structure, irrespective of which format that submission arrives in. In that sense, truly rather looking at the context than the file format that you're submitting into the registration endpoint. And then you could say that if you have these kind of specialty stores, you can guide into which of those specialty stores an incoming submission should actually be forwarded to. And that might mean that small molecules go only here into the compreg branch. Very large biologics like antibodies might only go into that large branch. But the hybrid ones, say peptides, for example, there is a sequence encoded in those. We have the ability to make them searchable by their sequence representation. But a lot of times you also look at them on a structure level. You might want to have them in both and just combine at a higher level the ability to then perform queries against the system. So that's really what we're looking at. And in this case, at the higher level, they will get their corporate identifier that can be based on individual entity types and things like that. But it opens up the opportunity to actually say that I've got a single system that covers them all. And if there is a need in order to kind of extend this further with other types of specific registration capabilities or representation capabilities, well, you can just add them in at the end of the day. With this, I'd like to conclude this presentation. I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
I'll share one that we get lots of times from clients. Do we need Oracle for the compound registration system?
You don't need Oracle, though it has a couple of advantages over MySQL. Then again, we do have some plans in the drawer, but I wouldn't be able to tell when we're going to realize that. But we're also looking at Postgres support due to the fact that you have some quite severe limitations with MySQL, plus you're able to connect this to our Postgres cartridge, which gives you corresponding benefits in terms of interrogating your compound collection.
If someone registers a structure and later that structure gets changed, do you save each version of the structure?
Yes.
In the audit trail? And what about like the registration quantity, amount, container barcode?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Once a structure has been submitted with metadata, we already create a snapshot of that information in the kind of submission. There is, if it fails validations, for example, people may change some of the data provided, may tweak the structure still. Even when it's not registered yet, we are tracing kind of a submission history. Then once it goes into the actual registry store, even there everything is then completely audited. Every single change that happens, we're going to record.
Thank you.